CBS News coverage of Campaign 84, Election Night, continues. And now from CBS News Election Headquarters in New York, here again is Dan Rather.
Good evening, everyone. Can Ronald Reagan make it a 50-state sweep if he is reelected? Does he bring in the power in the Congress, particularly get a working majority in the House that he needs and wants to get his program off to an early start in the second term? Right now, the Ronald Reagan bandwagon appears to be rolling. It's moving like a fast freight, already picking up players from the old New Deal coalition in the South. In this half hour, we should begin to get some indications of Ronald Reagan's snatching another section of the Democrats' old coalition band, blue-collar voters from the Midwest. Until now, this is the way the nation looked in terms of electoral votes. Ronald Reagan with 94, carrying all those states in red. Walter Mondale with 0. Now, it's just past 7:30 p.m. in the East, and most or all of the polls have just closed in 3 more states with a total of 42 electoral votes. And so the electoral vote total is growing. And of those 3 states that are just reported in, with 42 electoral votes, Ronald Reagan has carried all 3 of them. Walter Mondale, 0, zip, none, naren. And here's the way these electoral votes are growing. From Ohio, the Buckeye State, a Midwestern state with high unemployment, a must-do state for Walter Mondale. He and his staff acknowledge it. 23 big electoral votes, 0 for Mondale there. Ronald Reagan carries Ohio. North Carolina, the Tar Heel state, with 13 electoral votes. Ronald Reagan mows down Walter Mondale in North Carolina. And in West Virginia, the mountain state with 6 electoral votes that last election went for Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan wins in West Virginia. Every state where there's been a decision thus far, Ronald Reagan has won. Now, on the electoral vote total, Ronald Reagan is moving right along. In terms of the ballots in and counted, this is how it looks. Also moving along, 136 electoral votes for Ronald Reagan now, carrying all those states in red. Remember, it takes 270 electoral votes to win. Ronald Reagan already has nailed down 136 electoral votes. Walter Mondale, none. In terms of the national vote with ballots actually in and counted, this is the way it looks at this early hour. 2% of the vote in. Reagan leads Mondale 63 to 37%. Now, a note, if I may please. The polls remain open in wide sections of this big, great continental country of ours. If you haven't voted, your vote does count. Your vote does matter, because even if Ronald Reagan is going to be reelected, the question tonight is, does he or does he not get the kind of overwhelming sort of blank check mandate that he has been wanting for his second term, or does he not? Now, if you're in one of those areas where the polls are still open and you haven't voted, remember, that's at stake, and the presidential race itself has not yet been decided. Now, Bruce Morton, we're beginning to move in and get returns from the Midwest. Ohio, big unemployment state. West Virginia, big unemployment state. Ronald Reagan has already rated the old Democratic coalition in the South. Doesn't this indicate that he's beginning to rate it in the blue-collar, ethnic, backshop wards of Ohio and West Virginia?
Sure does, Dan. The elements of the old Franklin Roosevelt coalition are just coming apart here. This is a trend, you could argue, that started some years ago, but it's cresting here tonight. We talked earlier about the South going Republican, the white voters making the difference there. What we're seeing in this half hour, I think, is the union vote shredding away. Ohio and West Virginia are both heavily unionized states. Ronald Reagan has done very well. He got, according to our CBS News exit poll, 47% of the union vote in Ohio. That's up from his very good showing in the low 40s 4 years ago. We might just take a look at our exit poll for West Virginia, how a number of groups voted. That's, you know, a really gritty Democratic state, guys with coal dust in their hands for generations. Ronald Reagan carried men. Ronald Reagan carried women. No serious gender gap in West Virginia. He got 27% of the Democrats. Mondale, of course, got a majority of the Democrats, but still, that's an extraordinary showing. Independents by about 3 to 1, and in a state where over a third of the households are union households, Ronald Reagan is running very close. He and Walter Mondale just about even, Mr. Reagan with 46% of the union households in West Virginia. One other note about these 2 states, one of the questions we were asking as we came down to this is, will Jerry Ferraro make a difference? In Ohio, she made a difference. People who said the vice presidency was important were for George Bush by about 6 to 4. And in West Virginia, the same thing. It wasn't a big issue in either state, but those people who said it mattered on the Republican side.
Well, Bruce, the South win is looking big for Ronald Reagan. Too early to say that he's going to win the Midwest or win big, but certainly the indications here are that he may. We have two huge Senate races at stake in Ohio and in West Virginia. And Bob Schieffer, not in Ohio, I shouldn't have said that, in North Carolina and West Virginia. We don't have enough to report on the Helms-Hunt race, but some have called this the race of the century in North Carolina. And in West Virginia, with Ronald Reagan carrying West Virginia, this opens up the possibility, at least the possibility, that the favored Democrat in West Virginia, Jay Rockefeller, could have some trouble with Republican John Racy in that state.
Well, that race right now, Dan, is too close to call. And I think we're going to have a long night in the Senate because we also have a race too close to call down in Kentucky. That's Dee Huddleston versus Mitch McConnell. And in North Carolina, the one we all thought would be close, it is too close to call at this point.
Well, we're going to be catching up on those Senate races as we go through this hour. Right now, let's talk about the fact that throughout this long campaign, two of our most experienced and talented correspondents, Bill Plant and Susan Spencer, have been covering the two main camps, the President Reagan and former Vice President Walter Mondale camps. Bill Plant at the moment is in Los Angeles. Bill, no doubt President Reagan and his whole team are beginning to watch these returns with an eye to see whether this is a personal victory for President Reagan or whether it's a personal and policy and ideological victory for him.
Well, Dan, you know, even Ronald Reagan's oldest friends and advisors believe that he doesn't have any political coattails, that he's a political phenomenon unto himself, and that people vote for him because they like him or because they don't like his opponent. You know, that's one reason that the political pros on the Reagan campaign have been playing down for us the expectation of just how well that they'll do in the House of Representatives. They've been saying 12 to 15 seats. And it was only after Mr. Reagan recovered from that stumble in the first debate that he began actively trying to spread his coattails to campaign for other Republicans. You know, it may work, but basically they think it's a matter of personality, that Ronald Reagan isn't seen as a politician, and that they think is his magic. Dan?
Well, Bill, the president and his people talked just the last few days of possibly getting a 50-state sweep. Right now, in the electoral votes that have been decided on the basis of our CBS News estimate count, that possibility is alive and well. Do they think that there's a real, live, viable working chance that he could sweep 50 states?
They do. They hope to get 47 in a worst-case analysis as of yesterday morning. And they believe that they could get 50. And as we said earlier, Dan, they're already planning to call this a mandate based on the size of the popular vote and the number of states that they sweep. And they're already making plans about what to do with that mandate when they get it.
Bill, very quickly, what more than any other thing did the Reagan people think made him do so well among those ethnic blue-collar workers in places such as Ohio and even West Virginia?
Dan, one thing and one thing only, Walter Mondale.
Bill, we'll be coming back to you later on in the evening. Bob Schieffer, one indication of the size of this Reagan victory, if a Reagan victory indeed it is to be, may be those tight Senate races and whether the Democrats elect the people they thought they were going to elect in those Senate races.
Well, Howard Baker told me the other day that he thought the Republicans had a real chance in that race down in Kentucky, the one we were talking about. If Ronald Reagan did well in Kentucky, they thought they had a chance with Mitch McConnell, who is the county judge there in Louisville, to knock off Dee Huddleston, who's the Democratic incumbent. I would assume that Ronald Reagan is doing well there because, as we were saying just a minute ago, that race is now seen as too close to call. The race down in West Virginia, don't forget that Ronald Reagan went to West Virginia a couple of weeks ago. The Republicans have been saying all along that if you had to pick a place where you had a chance for an upset, they thought that would be it. They said, look, take odds if you want to bet on our candidate, but this might happen even though Mr. Rockefeller spent $7 million of his own money.
And Bill, I want to interrupt your flow there, but you want to stop and say $7 million at least that John D. Rockefeller IV, J. Rockefeller, the governor of West Virginia, spent trying to become the senator in West Virginia, and it looks like he's locked in a very, very tight race. How much does that work out per vote?
Oh, about, I would think around, well, it must be more than $10 a voter. But he is rich as Rockefeller, so.
There's certainly a race we want to watch. Right now, let's tee up a couple of these Senate races. Right now, you got two Senate races that anybody who knows very much about politics in this country really will be watching. In North Carolina, incumbent Republican Senator Jesse Helms, who stands as perhaps the brightest symbol of the new national right, trying to beat back the challenge of the Democratic Governor Jim Hunt. That's in North Carolina. And in West Virginia, for the seat of the retiring Democrat Jennings Randolph. Governor Jay Rockefeller, who thought he had it wrapped up in one, is locked in a tight duel with John Racy, what's called in West Virginia an ordinary millionaire, Mr. Racy, coming from newspapers, televisions, and steel industry. That's a race we'll be watching. Those two Senate races, as much as anything else tonight, may determine whether Ronald Reagan, if he's reelected, as it appears he may be, that if Ronald Reagan's reelected, it may determine whether Ronald Reagan has the kind of ideological situation in the Senate he'd like to say nothing of the House, which we'll be talking about a little bit later on. Right now, we want to go out to Minnesota and Susan Spencer, our correspondent who's been covering the Mondale campaign. Susan, it doesn't look good to say the least. Walter Mondale has fought a hard, classy campaign, but I have to believe right now he's saying some version of gather close around the fire, boys. It's getting cold out there.
And in fact, right now that he is meeting with his staff, he's having dinner with his staff. They have prepared an enormous scrapbook for him, featuring all the favorable editorials that ran in the last few weeks. It's a period of nostalgia. People are walking around here. Not all of them are very dry-eyed. This is sort of a double slap in the face in a way, because he had said in interviews done when it became obvious that he was going to have a very hard time winning, that what he hoped his candidacy was doing was warning the public against the dangers of what he saw of the influence of the right wing of the Republican Party. And if in fact things go as they appear, that warning would have appeared to be unheeded.
Susan, did Walter Mondale go into today feeling confident that he would at least carry Minnesota, his home state?
I don't think so, Dan. They haven't talked about polls with us for a good 2 weeks. It's all been an emphasis on their feelings they had about the crowds, very subjective things, his instincts as a politician. Nobody has claimed that he was going to win anything specific at all.
Thank you, Susan. Let's take a quick look at how some of the gubernatorial races are going. You will remember that in addition to the red-hot Senate races up and the whole question of what the makeup of the next House of Representatives is going to be, that a number of Senate seats, a number of gubernatorial places were up for grabs today. Let's look over some of those. But before we do that, I want to say to you that as of this moment, Walter Mondale has carried not a single state. Ronald Reagan is off to a very strong start in the race for the 270 electoral votes. As you can see with the map, it's Reagan with 136 electoral votes nailed down thus far. All the states in red have been carried by Ronald Reagan. Walter Mondale has 0. Nothing on the map colored blue for Walter Mondale as yet. Now, in the races for those governorships, let's take a look in North Carolina, a state carried by Ronald Reagan. This is a case of Reagan coattails, perhaps bringing in a Republican governor with him. Six-term incumbent former Davidson College professor Representative James Martin had been the underdog for a long time to Democratic Attorney General Rufus Edmiston, the former Watergate aide to Sam Ervin. It's Martin, the winner in North Carolina, the Republicans picking up a state house in North Carolina. This is for the seat of the retiring governor Jim Hunt, who's making that Senate race against Jesse Helms. In New Hampshire, Governor John Sununu, the Republican first-term incumbent, has, on the basis of our CBS News exit poll, this is our interviews with voters who'd actually voted today, Sununu is reelected in New Hampshire, beating back the challenge of the House Minority Leader and delicatessen owner Chris Spiro. So the Republicans hold on to their seat in New Hampshire. In Indiana, as expected, first-term incumbent Governor Robert Orr has beaten State Senator and Blackford County farmer Wayne Townsend in Indiana. So thus far, in the races for the governorships, one pickup for the Republicans in North Carolina, where James Martin has won there. In the race for the electoral votes, in the presidential race, 270 electoral votes needed to win. As of now, CBS News believes that Ronald Reagan has nailed down at least 136 electoral votes. Walter Mondale has none, so it remains an open question as to whether this can be a 50-state sweep for Ronald Reagan. In terms of the votes actually in and counted, 3% of the precincts nationwide in. Ballots actually tabulated. Reagan leads Mondale about 63% to 37%. Our CBS News coverage of who the next president is going to be. Can Ronald Reagan sweep 50 states? And if so, what kind of Congress does he have to work with? Our coverage of that continues after these messages. Back at our CBS News election headquarters in New York, to give you some benchmarks to go with, that two presidents in this half century, Franklin Roosevelt got 523 electoral votes. Richard Nixon got 520 electoral votes. Now, those are considered way beyond any landslide proportion. Lyndon Johnson wound up getting 61% plus of the national vote. He went over 61%. Four presidents since 1920, and only four, have gone over 60% of the national vote. Now, there's a long way to go tonight. Ronald Reagan may not even win re-election. He hasn't done so yet. But to give yourself some benchmarks, you may want to keep in mind that with 270 electoral votes needed to win, the breakaway all-time champs for this half century have been FDR and Richard Nixon. Now, with us in our studio in New York tonight, our CBS News election headquarters, Diane Sawyer. Diane, good evening to you.
Good evening, Dan.
We look forward to talking to you as the evening goes along. Right now, the thought occurs that the four-year election process is one way to look at ourselves. It kind of takes a snapshot of this nation at large. And talk with us some, if you will, about what the results so far tell us about ourselves.
Well, I will, Dan, and about what we're going to be looking for throughout the evening as we examine this snapshot and give all of you who have voted at home a chance to find yourself in the picture, to see how much America has changed and to see why it changed, to see the reasons that people voted the way they did. We're going to learn which groups in America tend to stick together and which groups tend to break apart when they vote. And with apologies to Ghostbusters, we think we're going to be in the business of doing a little cliche busting as we look at some of those results tonight. The American voter is changing so quickly, there are going to be a lot of surprises. For instance, let's take a look at that question that a lot of people have already begun asking about, the question of the gender gap, the fact that women last time around were less likely than men to vote for Ronald Reagan. Well, the early signs are that the gender gap is back and that it's expanding slightly. And that beneath it lies another gap, which is even more provocative in a lot of ways, a gap between women who go to work and women who stay at home and work at home. And we're going to be examining that closely and tell you why. Now, what about the union gap? Ronald Reagan nearly closed that in 1980, but most of the labor leaders went all out to bring in the labor vote for Walter Mondale. And we're going to learn if the rank and file decided to follow suit. Hispanic Americans, well, everyone knows that they're heavily Democratic, right? Maybe not. Republicans made inroads last election. We're going to see what happens tonight and why. And the Catholic vote, it turned up on the Republican side last time. Ferraro or not, the early signs are that the Republicans may win it again, and we'll tell you why. The black vote, the youth vote, the numbers there may surprise us too. And finally, if some of the old voting blocs seem to be disintegrating or at least shattering a little bit, is it possible that there are other interest groups that are starting to reform and some surprises there? For instance, we're going to tell you more about a new voting bloc, a bloc you may not have even thought of as a voting bloc before. Dan, one of our phrase-making colleagues said that the 1984 election may be the revenge of the white male, and we'll tell you why later.
Well, we'll be very interested to see when you put that analysis together. The early indication that the South has gone big for Ronald Reagan, and that would indicate that the hypothesis that this may turn out to be, and I don't like the phrase, I must say, the revenge of the white male, politically and pragmatically, it may turn out to be that. Like the Ghostbuster play, you know, the Reagan people tried to do that during the campaign, calling some of their younger campaign people the Fritz Busters.
That's right, and they even had outfits to support it.
We'll be talking to you as it goes along. The South is one key to the election returns thus far, and the very large electoral vote lead that Ronald Reagan has jumped off to. You can see from the map that many of the 136 electoral votes for Ronald Reagan come from those southern states. Florida, with 21 big electoral votes, has gone to Ronald Reagan. Not a single state has gone to Walter Mondale. And Ronald Reagan, this is the story of this half hour, has carried the states on the basis of our CBS News interviews with voters who left the polls. Ronald Reagan has carried Ohio and West Virginia, two big unemployment states, in addition to those states down in the Deep South. And so the questions, and they abound. This is going to be a very interesting election night in the sense that whether Ronald Reagan is reelected tonight is one question. The other is, can he sweep all 50 states? Does he get some historic new high in terms of the number of electoral votes? What about those hot Senate races? In West Virginia, Rockefeller and Racy locked in a very tight race. Helms and Hunt in a very tight race in North Carolina, and there are others. All of that we're going to be looking at as we go along tonight. We do, again, want to remind you that the polls are still open in wide sections of the country. If you're qualified to vote and you haven't voted, please go out and do so. You know, television is sparing no expense in its coverage of this election. We've tried not to, and Andy Rooney has a state-of-the-art example. Andy?
Well, Dan, I think of myself as being on sort of a standby basis here in case all this electronic equipment you have breaks down. There must be several $1 million worth of wires and machineries in here. Everything lights up. All the numbers light up. I have a piece of equipment here with me that you won't find here or at any of the other networks, and it could come in very handy later. This is a slate, a little blackboard. It cost me $5.95, and I'm going to put that on my expense account. These are some of the things it does here. Numbers. These are all numbers I made myself by hand. Homemade numbers they are. This is a 1 and a 2 over here, and this is a 4. You probably all remember how to make 4 from your school days before numbers just flashed up on a screen. On the other side of the blackboard, or slate, I have a one-loss column. This is Reagan, and this is Mondale. I'll put all the votes Reagan gets under this column, and all the votes Mondale gets in this column. At the end of the evening, I'll add them all up, and the person with the biggest number will be the winner. Now, if you want to announce it, Dan, you can, or I'll do it for you, whichever way you want to work it.
I'll let you announce it, Andy. And are you over budget or under budget?
We haven't worked that out yet, but $5.95 is close for me.
Thank you, Andy. In the next half hour, poll closing time in 16 big states. This could be the hour of decision. Stay with us. Don't go away. We'll be back with another 16 states with the polls closing and reports from them. Dan Rather at CBS News Election Headquarters in New York.
CBS News coverage of Campaign 84 election night continues. This portion is sponsored by Manufacturers Hanover, the financial source worldwide. By Sun Company, where there's sun, there's energy. And by MasterCard, MasterCard International, so worldly, so welcome. And now from CBS News Election Headquarters in New York, here again is Dan Rather.
CBS News estimates that Ronald Reagan has been re-elected president. The question remains, how big a mandate is he likely to get? Welcome back to our election coverage. The polls have just closed in 16 states with a total of 195 electoral votes in these states alone. On the basis of the results in those states and on interviews with voters as they left the polling places, CBS News now estimates that Ronald Reagan has been re-elected president of our United States. Until this hour, it takes 270 electoral votes to win. Ronald Reagan already has, as you saw on that, we estimate about 280. Now, up until this hour, President Reagan had all the states in red that you see here, 136 electoral votes. This is before we started counting these new votes in from the Midwest and from the South. This is how it looked before the polls closed in many states at this hour. Now, after the polls closed in the states at 8 o'clock, the electoral count began to grow. And of the states reporting this hour, of the 16 more states, Ronald Reagan has won 12 of these new states, putting his electoral vote total over the top with 280. Walter Mondale at this hour won 1, the District of Columbia. Mondale has yet to win a state, but as expected, we estimate that he has carried the District of Columbia, which gives Mondale 3 electoral votes. This is the way the map looks now. Virtually all red. Ronald Reagan, 280 electoral votes, at least we estimate he has now. Walter Mondale gets 3 in the District of Columbia. It's still alive and working. The District of Columbia blinking up there in the right-hand corner of your screen. Since the district is so small, we have to put it on a little blink there so you can see it. Ronald Reagan still has a chance for an historic 50-state sweep. Let's look where his new electoral votes come from, if you will. First of all, in New Jersey, the Garden State with 16 electoral votes, where Geraldine Ferraro, it had been hoped by Walter Mondale, might make a difference. Not so. Ronald Reagan carries New Jersey. In Illinois, the Prairie State, with 24 big electoral votes, Ronald Reagan has buried Walter Mondale in Illinois. In Michigan, the Wolverine State, with 20 electoral votes. On the basis of our interviews with voters as they left the polls, our CBS News exit poll indicates Ronald Reagan has also carried Michigan. In Texas, 29 electoral votes in Texas, one of the mega electoral states of the South and Southwest. Ronald Reagan rolls on to victory in Texas as well. In Connecticut, the nutmeg state, with 8 electoral votes, it goes to Ronald Reagan, as does the state of Maine. Maine, with 4 electoral votes, is carried by Ronald Reagan as expected. Delaware, a state that has voted with the winner in the last 8 straight presidential elections, only 3 electoral votes in the first state. Delaware also drops into the Reagan column. Tennessee, the volunteer state, 11 electoral votes. Ronald Reagan rolls over Walter Mondale in Tennessee as well. Oklahoma, the Sooner state, 8 electoral votes there. Ronald Reagan has beaten Walter Mondale in Oklahoma as well. Kansas, the Sunflower State and one of the most Republican states in the Union, Ronald Reagan wins its 7 electoral votes. Missouri, the Show Me State, a border state where Walter Mondale thought he just might have a chance. 11 electoral votes at stake. Ronald Reagan wins those 11 electoral votes. North Dakota, the Sioux State, 3 electoral votes. Ronald Reagan, as expected, wins it. And in the District of Columbia, which was widely expected to go for Walter Mondale, it has gone for Mondale, and so Mondale gets on the board with 3 electoral votes from the District of Columbia. This is the way the map looks now. Southern states, Midwestern states are now moving on out into the Midwest, even the upper Midwest now. Every state that has reported thus far has gone to Ronald Reagan. Only the District of Columbia, with its 3 electoral votes, has gone to Mondale. Reagan, we estimate now, has at least 280 electoral votes. Remember, it takes 270 electoral votes to win. Walter Mondale has 3. In terms of the national vote, actual votes in and tabulated, 3% of the precincts reporting Reagan leads Mondale 62% to 38%. The Reagan tally is 1,730,000 votes. Mondale with just over 1 million votes. But remember, there are 538 electoral votes, and in the Electoral College is where it counts. Reagan is over the top with 280 of those electoral votes, we estimate. Now, Bruce Morton, not a surprising result, but how did the president fashion this victory?
Well, not surprising, Dan, maybe a little bigger than people thought. Of course, you could make the argument all he really needed to do was win Delaware. Delaware is never wrong. It's always with the winner. And Ed Rollins, the manager of the Reagan-Bush campaign, said at one point, listen, we just go and spread a couple of $1 million around Delaware. There's no way we can lose this thing. Seriously, I'd kind of like to turn that around a little and talk about what Walter Mondale tried to do. Mr. Reagan ran on peace and prosperity, and that's usually a winner. This is clearly a landslide. We don't yet quite know its geographic limits, but it'll be astonishing if the West turns around. That's been bedrock Republican territory for some elections past now. But we might take a look, based on our CBS News New York Times exit poll, at some of the groups Walter Mondale thought he might be able to get to come his way. First, young people. In fact, today, according to our poll, young people voted for the Reagan-Bush ticket. The Democrats said hope that, as youth has in the past, it would vote Democratic this time. They hope that a lot of the younger, the upwardly mobile professionals, yumpies in that word we all heard so often this year, would object to the Jerry Falwell kind of conservatism, rules about abortion and school prayer and all that. In fact, about a quarter of Gary Hart's voters in the Democratic primaries voted for Ronald Reagan today. The Democrats have historically had the older voters worried about Medicare and Social Security. Mr. Mondale tried to make those issues, but those people went today for Ronald Reagan. Farmers, another group that once upon a time in Franklin Roosevelt's day used to vote pretty solidly Democratic, they today were for the Reagan-Bush ticket. Women, sick transit Gloria gender gap, I suppose, women voted Republican today. And Italian Americans, it was thought that if Geraldine Ferraro were a help anywhere, she would be a help with Catholics and Italian Americans. That didn't work either. As far as issues are concerned, Mr. Mondale spent a lot of his time talking about the deficit and the need to raise taxes to bring it down. Voters today said they didn't want to raise taxes to bring it down. They were on Mr. Reagan's side of that argument, and they also gave him credit as a strong leader. So you could argue, Dan, that the Mondale campaign tried to do 2 or 3 particular things. They thought they'd get credit for boldness by coming out in favor of raising taxes. That backfired. They thought that picking a woman for vice president, a truly bold stroke, might help them. It apparently didn't. They pinned a lot of faith on the debates. And people in our poll today just said the debates didn't make very much difference with them one way or the other. So the Mondale campaign took some gambles and lost.
Lost all of them except in the District of Columbia from the states reporting thus far, which reminds me, Bruce, and I know that you and I were just talking about this, that there's still a great deal at stake in those states where the polls are still open. When we encourage people to go out there and vote, it is a case that there's still a lot at stake. First of all, there is the question of how big a victory this is going to be. Ronald Reagan, his hopes for an unprecedented 50-state sweep, those hopes still alive and working. That's one big question, how big the win? The other big question, how long, how powerful will the Reagan coattails be? He's got an avalanche going. Now, is he going to be able to pull in the wake of that avalanche some additional Republican senators in? The Republicans have control of the Senate. Is he going to be able to pull in an ideological majority in the House of Representatives? Now, that's where those states where the polls are still open in the Midwest and West can still make a tremendous difference. Bill Moyers, we've been talking about the how of this victory. And Bruce has done such a good job of explaining how this was fashioned, but what about the why that Ronald Reagan is winning? One can't escape the conclusion that it's something more than just imagery and personal popularity.
With all those polls out there, one is a little reluctant to talk much about the positive qualities of a man whose fate is still up in the air, whose election is not over. But the fact of the matter is there are several key reasons why Ronald Reagan is pulling it off. First of all, of course, is prosperity. I stopped at Tony's Deli this morning across the street to get a sandwich, and Tony said in there, well, we're going 100% for Ronald Reagan in this deli. And I said, why, Tony? And he said, 3 years of prosperity. There's a young Italian fellow we ran into who put it this way. He said, you know, I play at weddings, and 5 years ago, people couldn't afford to have me, and if I went, they didn't feed us. Now we have more bookings than we can manage, and they feed us at all these weddings. You know, the economy has registered a healthy recovery. Unemployment is down appreciably, and inflation is down considerably. I think most people just don't remember how 5 years ago so many people were frightened to death of inflation. Ronald Reagan believed inflation was the worst enemy, and he waited at great risk for the recession to cure it. People have more money to spend. Prosperity is one reason. He kept his promises. You know, in 1980, he said he would cut taxes, he would cut social spending, he would increase defense spending, and he delivered. Part of his strength has come from the fact that he got through Congress the most important items in his legislative program when he said he would, very early on, soon after somebody had said of Jimmy Carter that he couldn't get the Pledge of Allegiance through Congress. And much of Ronald Reagan's strength in the public perception comes because he delivered on his promises. People were ready for this. You know, 1964, people voted for peace and got war. 1968, they voted for law and order and got a gang that tried to steal the Constitution. 1976, they voted for competence and got disarray and malaise in the White House. They wanted a president who delivered on his promises, and Jimmy Carter did.
You mean Ronald Reagan did?
I mean, Ronald Reagan did. Jimmy Carter didn't. Performance. He's given a good performance in the White House in the service of his convictions. And one thing you can't say about Reagan is you can say that he has convictions and he stays with them. You know, no one is saying today, as they did 4 years ago, that it's impossible to govern this country, or at least it's impossible to be president. There's a professor down at Penn State named Robert Murray who says that Ronald Reagan has done something democracy needs doing. He's strengthened the leadership role of the White House in a time when so many forces are working to pull us together. He has been a leader in the White House. That's been appealing. His philosophy. You know, Dan, we are in a period in which people are more concerned with private interest and the commercial interest than they have been in a long time. At the end of the New Deal era, some people are saying. And there is a mood in the country that Ronald Reagan fits. You know, in midlife, he chose a set of conservative principles, and he stuck with them. He's been one of the most consistent men in American public life, and today he's riding the tide, which he may have helped to create, of a conservative mood in the country. There's also his personality. I think you saw it when he got up from being shot, cracked a joke, and then speedily recovered and went back to the White House. Psychology. He keeps saying we'll lift America up. Eisenhower said, morale is the single greatest factor in winning a war. That's true in politics, too. Ronald Reagan's been campaigning on an economic and spiritual revival. He projects what he considers an affirmative moral vision. That's what Democrats used to do. All of these factors add up to a man, an enormously successful politician.
And, Bill, he's understood the use of symbols. You talked about morale. You talked about making the country feel good about itself. It's much more than that. His policies have counted for plenty. His keeping his promises. But any leader, particularly a leader in a big continental country such as this one, has to understand the use of symbols and symbolism, and Ronald Reagan has understood that very strong and powerfully.
Abraham Lincoln said, public opinion is everything. With public sentiment, nothing can fail. Without it, nothing can succeed. Consequently, he who molds public opinion goes deeper than he who enacts statutes and pronounces decisions.
Now, Bill, we're going to be talking as the evening goes along about realignment. Our CBS News estimate is that Ronald Reagan will be re-elected president. Still a lot to be decided, and a lot to be decided in those Midwestern and Western states about the size of the win and what Ronald Reagan's coattails are or not going to be. Republican Senator Charles Percy fighting for his political life out in Illinois against Paul Simon. He latched on to Ronald Reagan's coattails, or really the first time in his career latching on to Ronald Reagan's coattails. It'll be interesting to see whether that's enough to pull Percy through. All those questions yet to be decided. But when we talk about realignment, you mentioned it, one can argue that the old alignment of the New Deal coalition has been shattered, but is a new alignment going to be in place after this election, even if Ronald Reagan wins it in monumental proportions?
I really would like to beg off of that until we see more returns from tonight from Bob Schieffer and Leslie Stahl in those races. And on that point, Dan, it seems to me appropriate to say that Andy Rooney could call this election right now with his little blackboard on the basis of what we know. But it's very important for people to vote. This is not just simply a banal statement. If you believe that Ronald Reagan should have a House and a Senate that goes his way, go and vote for the person in your district or your state who's likely to do that. If you believe that Ronald Reagan should be checked and should be balanced and that the Democratic Party should be a strong opposition party, then you'll go and vote the other way. But the point I'm trying to make is, just because the electoral votes already add up to a victory for Ronald Reagan, your vote may even be more important, whether you are for Ronald Reagan or against Ronald Reagan. So go out there and cast that vote. It still matters.
Let's take a look at the national map for just a moment to review. 16 additional states reported this hour. This is the way the map looks. Ronald Reagan with 280 electoral votes by our CBS News estimate. The states in red, Reagan. Mondale in blue. You can't see the blue. It's because up there in the District of Columbia is the only place that Walter Mondale has carried. He carried the District of Columbia. Ronald Reagan has carried everything else thus far. The little dot blinking up there, grandmother, if you can't see it, put your glasses on there. I can barely see it myself. It's so small. But all the other states that we have made calls in thus far have gone to Ronald Reagan, including the big ones of Texas, Florida, Illinois, have all dropped. What we're watching at this hour, in addition to how big Ronald Reagan's victory is going to be, is whether he can pull into the Senate and House with him enough new members, particularly in the House, to give him a working majority to get through the policies he wants. You can expect to see Ronald Reagan in a new second term come forward in the first 80 or 90 days with a program he wants passed in Congress. And what's still up for grabs in this election is whether he's going to have enough in the Senate and the House to get such a program through. That's among the things that we'll be watching. Among the Senate races we're keeping a very close eye on, still a close race indicated in West Virginia between Jay Rockefeller and John Racy, and the Helms-Hunt race is still up for grabs. These pictures are coming from Minnesota, Mondale headquarters in St. Paul, Minnesota. Mondale is now arriving at his hotel in St. Paul. Smiling Fritz Mondale, shaking hands with his supporters.
Mondale, can we get your reaction? The networks have all called this to the president. Did you?
Susan Spencer asking former Vice President Mondale for a reaction. He looked at her, a slight smile, and as much to say, maybe later, but not just now. Whether you like him or not like him, whether you agree with him or not, Walter Mondale ran a strong, tough, classy campaign as he saw it. Never during the campaign, I guess never, perhaps too strong a word, never whined, never complained. Just now, things do not look well for Walter Mondale, but he, like we, will now be looking to see how big is the margin by which Ronald Reagan wins. Does Ronald Reagan get that historic 50-state sweep? Our CBS News coverage of those and other questions will continue in a moment. As Ronald Reagan rose to victory, and the question is how long are his coattails, we're beginning to get some answers in Senate races. Let's look them over. Senate races reporting in now. In Massachusetts, a state not yet decided in the presidential race, the Democrat, the founder of the Vietnam Veterans Against the War, Lieutenant Governor John Kerry, has beaten back the challenge of Sugar Ray Shammy, the businessman who ran against Ted Kennedy in 1982 and beat Elliot Richardson in the primary. But Kerry, the Democrat, wins the Senate race in Massachusetts. That's for the seat of the retiring Paul Tsongas. It's a keep for the Democrats. In Texas, former Democratic representative, now Republican Phil Gramm, has beaten Lloyd Doggett on the basis of our CBS News exit polling interviews with people leaving the polls. Graham holds on to the Republican Senate seat in Texas. This is the seat of the retiring John Tower. In Tennessee, a pickup for the Democrats. Representative Albert Gore Jr., 4 terms in the U.S. House of Representatives. His father served in the House and Senate. And here's a future comer for the Democrats. Albert Gore picks up the former Republican Senate seat of the retiring Howard Baker, the Senate Majority Leader in Tennessee, a pickup for the Democrats there. Reagan won the state of Tennessee, but Gore picks up the Senate seat. In New Jersey, Dollar Bill Bradley, the United States Senator, former professional basketball player, as expected, beat Mary Mocheri, the former mayor of Montclair. Bradley holds on to the Democratic Senate seat in New Jersey. In Delaware, Senator Joseph Biden, 2-term incumbent, has beaten John Burris, the former state representative and frozen food businessman. Biden, who'd like to think of himself as possibly a future presidential or vice presidential candidate, holds on to his Democratic seat in Delaware. In Oklahoma, Democrat Senator Dave Boren, former governor, has beaten the former Cameron University instructor Bill Crozier in Oklahoma. And so while President Reagan carried Oklahoma in the presidential race, the Democrats hold on to the Senate seat there. In Kansas, which has gone for President Reagan in the Senate race, as expected, Senator Nancy Kassebaum, one of the 2 women in the United States Senate, Paul Hawkins of Florida being the other, has won re-election in Kansas. And in Maine, Republican Senator Bill Cohen, the former congressman, has won a second term in the Maine Senate, beating back the challenge of State Representative House Majority Leader Elizabeth Libby Mitchell. Cohen holds on to the Republican Senate seat in Maine. Now, Bob Schieffer's still out. Big race in North Carolina, big race in Illinois, big race in West Virginia. All of those very big Senate races.
As yet, though, we have not had an incumbent beaten in any Senate race. We've had 15 races cold now, Dan. The incumbents have won every time that they've run.
Let's take a quick look at the national vote as it stands at this hour. The national vote, with very few precincts reporting, shows Reagan beating Mondale 61 to 39%. In terms of the Electoral College vote, our CBS News estimate is that with 270 electoral votes needed to win, Ronald Reagan now stands with more than enough to win with 280. Walter Mondale has 3, winning only the District of Columbia. Now, closing at this next half-hour mark, we have the state of Arkansas. Stay with us to see how big the Reagan win is going to be. Can he win all 50 states? And will he pull in an ideological majority in the House of Representatives with him? Dan Rather, CBS News, election headquarters in New York.
This is continuing election coverage for Southern Arizona from Channel 13 News.
Young cancer patients, tomorrow morning at 9 on Donahue.
CBS News coverage of Campaign 84 election night continues. From CBS News election headquarters in New York, here again is Dan Rather.
Hello again, and the firestorm for Ronald Reagan continues to sweep the country. So far tonight, the polls have closed in 30 states, and so far, each and every one of those states have given their electoral votes to Ronald Reagan. Reagan, we estimate, CBS News estimates, now has at least 280 electoral votes. Walter Mondale has carried only the District of Columbia with 3. The big question, the coattail question, how wide, how deep is the Reagan victory? A victory for Ronald Reagan personally, or is it a victory too for the Reagan agenda for the next 4 years that will give him a Congress that will vote for Reagan programs and policies? The magic number in the House of Representatives is if Ronald Reagan picks up 26 additional, if he gets a swing of 26 House seats, he figures he's going to have a House of Representatives that will go along with his policies. That's what's at stake from here on out, in addition to a number of red-hot Senate races yet to be decided. The Percy Simon race in Illinois is very close. The Racy Rockefeller race in West Virginia, the Helms Hunt race in North Carolina close. It's 8:30 p.m. in the East right now. Poll closing time in one additional state. in the land of opportunity in Arkansas. Arkansas, our CBS News estimate is that Ronald Reagan has carried the state of Arkansas. Here's the state that Walter Mondale thought he might carry. Not going to happen. With 6 electoral votes, Ronald Reagan gets the 6 electoral votes in Arkansas and keeps his hopes for a 50-state sweep alive. Do his coattails have any effect in Arkansas? Let's take a look, because there's a Senate race in Arkansas in which a Democratic incumbent, Senator David Pryor, a former governor, has held off a late challenge from the 3-term Republican, the only Republican to resign his place in the House of Representatives to challenge a Democratic incumbent senator, has lost in Arkansas, despite the fact that Ronald Reagan carried the state. David Pryor, the Democrat, holds on to the seat. When Bethune attacked Pryor, saying that Pryor had voted against the Reagan program, Pryor fought back and said, hey, they wanted to cut even the benefits to a widow with one arm, and I wouldn't vote for that kind of program. Apparently that sort of aggressive campaign helped Democratic Senator Pryor win in Arkansas. Also a gubernatorial race in Arkansas, another chance to see whether the Reagan coattails are taking effect in some of these southern states. In Arkansas, the Democratic incumbent governor, former Rhodes Scholar, Governor Bill Clinton, wins re-election, beating back the challenge of Jonesboro businessman Woody Freeman. So while President Reagan carries, on the basis of our CBS News exit polling, the state of Arkansas, Reagan carries Arkansas, but the Democrats hold on to their Senate seat and the State House in Arkansas. Now here's the way the map looks now at this hour. Ronald Reagan continuing to have every state where a decision has been made. Ronald Reagan, it's Ronald Reagan red in all of those states. Walter Mondale has carried thus far only the District of Columbia. Now, these returns from Arkansas, Bruce Morton, tell us that at least in that state, the Reagan coattails were not strong enough and long enough to carry in any Republicans.
Well, that's right, Dan, and I think we're going to have to wait a little while to see how the coattail effect works out, but a couple of thoughts about that. Ronald Reagan ran a very successful tactical campaign. They kept the focus where they wanted it, so maybe a little uncertainty over taxes in the beginning, a little uncertainty after the first debate, but by and large, the focus was on Mr. Reagan as a strong leader, popular personality, and one question: are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? So when you come to think about the kind of coattails with which Mr. Reagan approaches his second term, a couple of thoughts. One is kind of a good news, bad news thing. He got through this campaign without making any promises to anybody. On the other hand, he also got through this campaign without really offering the country a program for the second term. So between now and January, he's going to have to figure out how he wants to use whatever coattails he has, where he wants to take the country in 1985. One other thing about coattails, Dan, it's not just who wins and loses today, but even people who are in no trouble. House Speaker Tip O'Neill, for instance, is going to have to look a little differently at Ronald Reagan, the winner of this new landslide, than he would at a Reagan who'd squeaked by in a close election, say.
Well, Bruce, on Pennsylvania, and when you talk about the Rust Belt, Pennsylvania has to be the buckle on the Rust Belt. Our CBS News estimate is that in the state of Pennsylvania, Ronald Reagan has carried Pennsylvania. Now, here, in addition to Pennsylvania having 25 electoral votes, a pickup of 25 electoral votes for Ronald Reagan, here is a state where Walter Mondale, to the very end, thought he might have a chance to carry this state. Not to be. Walter Mondale trying one last time, Bruce, to put together the coalition, and Pennsylvania has the whole old New Deal coalition of ethnic blue-collar workers, large percentage of blacks, go right down the list. Ronald Reagan wins Pennsylvania and keeps alive his chance for a 50-state sweep. Thus far, Walter Mondale has carried only the District of Columbia by our CBS News estimate, and thus Ronald Reagan has a chance for a win of historic proportions. If you're saying to yourself, well, I don't know whether the rest of this evening matters or not, it matters plenty, particularly for those of you who have not yet voted, because Ronald Reagan, does the country give Ronald Reagan a 50-state sweep? Does Ronald Reagan give a pickup of at least 26 seats in the House of Representatives? Leslie, we want to be coming to you very shortly to see whether the Reagan coattails are taking effect in some of those important House races, and a number of them are beginning to fall into place now. But for the moment in Los Angeles right now is President Reagan's Chief of Staff, James Baker, a former attorney from Houston, Texas, a man who's run for public office himself, and as much as anybody, the principal architect of this highly successful Ronald Reagan campaign. Jim Baker, thank you for being with us. Congratulations to you on a great victory. Is this a personal victory for Ronald Reagan only, or is it a victory also for his policies, and what is he going to do with the next 4 years?
Well, thank you, Dan. I think it's clearly a personal victory for Ronald Reagan, but I think it could be a victory as you suggested, of historic proportions if what's happening, according to your projections in the East, carries over into the West. As far as what the president will do with a new mandate, should it take effect and take place, and as you know, we've agreed with the other campaign we will not claim victory nor concede defeat until the polls close in the West. But should that happen, I think what you might see the president concentrating on is preserving the peace, making sure America remains prepared for peace, seeing if he can't achieve a meaningful arms reduction agreement with the Soviet Union rather than some agreement that just continues to legitimize a continuing escalation of the arms race. And I think on the domestic front, Dan, what you'll see is perhaps an effort at historic tax simplification. And that's not an easy task, regardless of what happens in House races tonight. Even if Republicans pick up a number of seats, it's not going to be an easy task to accomplish tax simplification. And further, additional cuts in federal spending. And of course, the president's been cutting federal spending for 4 years, and it's not going to be easy to keep that up either.
Yeah, Baker, you're a Texan, and you know how they talk at home. They say, let's talk turkey for a minute. If President Reagan gets the overwhelming re-election victory that seems to be building, is the Reverend Jerry Falwell and others who consider themselves architects of the national new right going to increase in influence with this administration, and is their agenda going to be reintroduced by President Reagan as the agenda for the country, or is a re-elected President Reagan going to concentrate on such things as arms control, which you mentioned?
Well, the president's already said that there's no higher priority as far as he's concerned than arms control and peace. Nor is there any higher priority than making sure that this economic recovery and expansion we've been enjoying for the last 2 years continues unabated. Nevertheless, the president ran in 1980 on restoring traditional values to this country. He ran again on that this year, and those positions were not unimportant to the final result. I think it's important to keep in mind, though, that the Reverend Falwell, who's a very good supporter of the president and whose support the president has welcomed, doesn't dictate policy or judicial choices to the President of the United States. And I think much was made of that by the opposition, and the President in the second debate, I think, put that to rest by pointing out that Reverend Falwell opposed the appointment of Sandra Day O'Connor, who's been a superb justice of the Supreme Court.
Jim Baker with the Reagan team in California. Some said this election boiled down to cash. That is to say that people like Ronald Reagan's values, but mostly they like the fact that he at least created the perception of an economy bouncing back, even more than a perception. When you talk about some sort of a tax, what did you call it, tax reform, tax
simplification.
Tax simplification. Is that going to cost me and every other American money?
No, it's probably going to put money in your pocket, you and every other American, hopefully. What the president would like to do is reduce tax rates further. And he thinks that you can do that by simplifying the tax code, which making it more fair and more simple so that you don't need a Philadelphia lawyer to fill out your tax return, and maybe finding a way that a lot of income that escapes taxation now is ultimately taxed. So those of us who are paying our fair share don't pay any more than our fair share.
Thank you very much, Jim Baker, and please give our very best to First Lady Nancy Reagan. We hope she's feeling better after the last couple of days.
Thank you, Dan.
Thanks a lot. Ronald Reagan has carried the state of Pennsylvania. Our CBS News estimate is that Ronald Reagan will be reelected. A lot of big questions still to be decided, including how big will the mandate be and does he sweep all 50 states? We'll discuss the answers to those questions, and our CBS News coverage will continue in a moment. Ronald Reagan sweeping to re-election. The question, how long are his coattails? How many Republicans is he going to pull in with him? Keep in mind that the evening started with the Republicans controlling the United States Senate 55 to 45. Thus far, the Democrats have picked up one Senate seat. Albert Gore, the young congressman in Tennessee, has won Howard Baker's old seat in Tennessee, so it's a net gain for the Democrats in the Senate so far of one seat. In the House of Representatives, the evening started with the Democrats controlling the House of Representatives 267 to 166. No chance, by everybody's acknowledgement, for the Republicans to take actual control in the House of Representatives, but a lot of chance, said the Republicans, that maybe they could get a working ideological control. In order to do that, they'd need to pick up about 26 Senate seats. 26 Senate seats in way of a Republican pickup is considered to be the magic number. 26 or above, Ronald Reagan would have a working ideological majority in the House of Representatives. So where the polls are still open, and they're still open in a lot of states, particularly in the Midwest and the West, those are among the things being decided, and Ronald Reagan still has a chance for a 50-state sweep. He's carried every state where the decision is in thus far. Walter Mondale has carried only the District of Columbia. We haven't heard, however, yet in terms of a presidential vote decision from Massachusetts, Maryland, or Minnesota. All three of those are states where Walter Mondale thought he might have a chance to carry them, to say nothing of the states out west, Washington, Oregon, California, to name just three, where Walter Mondale believed that he had a pretty good chance to carry them. But let's talk about these House races. Leslie Stahl, the president's coattails thus far have not demonstrated great pulling power in terms of the Senate races. It's still a little early in terms of the House, but I gather there's some early indications that the president's coattails may be pulling in some additional Republicans in the House.
Well, it is early in terms of the specific races, but according to our CBS News exit polling, the people who are voting for Republicans for the House are about 10% more than they were 2 years ago during the recession in almost every demographic category except blacks. And we're seeing it most significantly in the blue-collar areas. In blue-collar areas 2 years ago, the voters went 61% to 35% for the Democrats for House races. This time, it switched around, 50% for the Republicans, 43% for the Democrats. Another significant group that's switching from 2 years ago, voting Democratic last time, Republican this time for House members, are senior citizens. That's a little surprising because we thought that the senior citizens were going to stay with the Democrats. In 82, 56% voted for the Democrats. Today, it's 43% for the Democrats, 53% for the Republicans. That's giving us a sense at this point, Dan, that the House changes, the gains for the Republicans may be significant, but as you said before, we don't have many specific returns. The ones we have are no surprises. The people in our poll are telling us that the main reason they're switching from Democrat to Republican is because of the economy. Not a big surprise there.
Well, this election was cast in, among other ways, as hope versus the recession. That Walter Mondale concentrated on the recession, Ronald Reagan concentrated on hope in the future. And the presidential race, hope is won. We'll see as the House races go along. Bob, we don't have time to check on all those Senate races, but we've got some. The Illinois Senate race, Percy versus Simon, still too close, no decision there. West Virginia, Rockefeller versus Racy, no decision there. Anything in North Carolina in the way of a decision yet?
Nothing yet. So far, all the incumbents have won in the races that we have decided. 16 races have been called so far. Democrats have won 9, Republicans won 7. Dan.
Well, and also
one turnover in Massachusetts. I beg your pardon, in Tennessee.
One turnover in Tennessee, and the Republicans have a chance. The Republicans have a chance for a pickup in Kentucky because the Kentucky race has not yet been decided. Now, we're going to talk more about President Reagan giving a new meaning to the phrase Solid South, and also picking up a lot of the blue-collar ethnic votes after we pause for these messages. Okay. Arkansas and Pennsylvania, among other states, have gone to Ronald Reagan. One of the reasons that President Reagan has done so well thus far tonight, particularly in the Midwestern states, carrying such states as Illinois and Ohio, and where you see some signs of Reagan coattails already, is the inroads he's making into the blue-collar vote. And to discuss that, let's go to our Midwest CBS News election headquarters in Meredith, Vieira. Meredith?
region of the country. Our CBS News New York Times exit poll shows that Mondale has 60% of the blue-collar union vote, Reagan with about 38%. Now, a key Democratic strategist in Michigan said to me, now watch the union, the blue-collar union vote when it comes out of Michigan and Ohio. I guarantee to you that there won't be as strong in Michigan. Well, we did watch it tonight, Dan, and we found that he's right. In both states, Mondale appears to be doing very well with the blue-collar union vote, much better than the president, but he's doing better in Ohio than in Michigan. Now, the strategist who talked to me a few days ago, this was his theory, and it may bear some listening to. He said that the unions in Michigan especially had done too good a job in helping the workers there to make a lot of money. You have workers on assembly lines in auto plants, UAW, supported workers, who are making $30,000 and they own a second home. They no longer perceive of themselves as needing organized labor the way they might have 10, 15, 20 years ago. They now perceive of themselves as part of that elite middle class, taxpayers, not part of the party of the have-nots. And he said that's why the labor vote in Michigan would be a little bit lower than Ohio. He may be right, we don't know. At any rate, overall, the blue-collar union vote appears to be going to Mondale in the Midwest strongly, and that's got to be good news for union leaders. Dan?
Thank you, Meredith. Well, the story at this hour thus far, in the South, the Northeast, and the Midwest, Walter Mondale has seen the light at the end of the tunnel, and it's out. What once might have been considered a tailor-made for Mondale State, ethnic voters, blue-collar voters, old ailing industry, Pennsylvania tonight in the Ronald Reagan column, down in the southern part of the country, Arkansas goes for Reagan. In the hour to come, a good indication if the Reagan sweep of the United States will be stopped in two big states. In the coming hour, New York and Mondale's home state, Minnesota. In all, polls will be closing in 11 more states very shortly, so stay with us. Dan Rather at CBS News Election Headquarters in New York.
CBS News coverage of Campaign 84 election night continues. This portion is sponsored by General Motors. Extra time, extra effort, and attention to every detail. GM is committed to excellence. By Sun Company, where there's sun, there's energy. And by IBM typewriters. No matter how you look at typing, we're your type. And now from CBS News election headquarters in New York, here again is Dan Rather.
And again, an hour of decision for the Democratic presidential and vice presidential candidates. Can they stop Ronald Reagan's so far clean sweep of the states in their home states? Minnesota, Walter Mondale's home state, New York, Geraldine Ferraro's home state. What may be the last two big lines of resistance to a 50-state Reagan sweep? Now, another 6 states with 102 electoral votes have just seen most or all of their polls close as it went past this hour mark. It's just past 9 o'clock in the East, and another batch of 6 states have had polls closing. Now, in the poll closing states of this hour, 6 of them, all 6 went to Ronald Reagan. In Nebraska, the Cornhusker state and one of the most Republican states in the Union, 5 electoral votes going to Ronald Reagan. South Dakota, the Coyote state, 3 electoral votes as expected. Ronald Reagan mowing down Walter Mondale there. In Louisiana, the Pelican State's 10 electoral votes also go Ronald Reagan red. In Colorado, the Centennial State with 8 electoral votes, Ronald Reagan sweeps to victory there. Arizona, the Grand Canyon state where it was considered hopeless for Mondale, it turns out to be hopeless for him. Arizona's 7 electoral votes go to Ronald Reagan. New Mexico, land of enchantment, enchanting for Ronald Reagan in that he sweeps away Walter Mondale in New Mexico, a state where Mondale once thought he had a chance, maybe, just maybe, to carry it. Couldn't do so. So again, Ronald Reagan has carried all 6 of the states where the polls closed on the hour mark that just passed. Now, if Mondale and Ferraro are to prevent a 50-state Reagan sweep, they've got to start showing it presumably fairly soon. New York, Ferraro's home state, Minnesota, Walter Mondale's home state. Massachusetts and Maryland haven't dropped yet. Mondale and Ferraro could hope to have some chance there, and then they have to start looking west to Washington, Oregon, and California if they're going to prevent this 50-state Reagan sweep, which the Republicans are pulling so hard for. Now, let's take a look at the national vote. We've given you the electoral vote. Ronald Reagan is already well over the top on the electoral vote, with 11% of the precincts reporting nationwide. Votes in and tabulated, Reagan leads Mondale 61% to 39%. Reagan with just over 6.5 million votes. Mondale with just over 4 million votes. But the electoral total is where it counts, and with 270 electoral votes needed to win, our CBS News estimate is that Ronald Reagan has already passed that total, and by a considerable margin. Those of you who haven't voted, we urge you to vote, because the questions that remain open: how big a Reagan win will it be? Does he sweep all 50 states? Mondale thus far has carried only the District of Columbia. And does Ronald Reagan get keep control, actual control of the Senate for the Republicans, and get a working majority in the House of Representatives? Now, Bob Schieffer, the one ray of good news for Walter Mondale, the one place where the coattails did not extend, is in Tennessee. Albert Gore has picked up what was a Republican seat in Tennessee.
And that's right, and Ronald Reagan was running very strong in Tennessee, Dan. At one point last week, I saw a poll that showed Ronald Reagan with more than a 30-point lead over Walter Mondale in Tennessee, while at the same time, Albert Gore, who has just been elected to the Senate tonight, had a 30-point lead over his Republican opponent.
Bob, I want to get back to you. It's just that there's the Gore winning by about 60 to 37%. Ash, the Knoxville lawyer, never was given much chance against Gore. Gore certainly will be talked about as a future Democratic presidential or vice presidential possibility. But the reason I interrupted, we have some decisions now in other Senate races. Let's quickly look them over, and then you and I will discuss them. In Minnesota, Walter Mondale's home state, where a woman was considered to have a fairly good chance of unseating a Republican incumbent. No, sir, no, ma'am, isn't going to happen. Republican incumbent Senator Rudy Boschwitz, the plywood king, he operates a big plywood company, a first-term incumbent, has won re-election in the state of Minnesota. We don't know whether Walter Mondale has carried his home state in the presidential election, but Boschwitz holds on to a Republican seat in Minnesota, beating back the challenge of Joan Grove, the Secretary of State. In New Mexico, the Senate race, Republican Senator Pete Domenici, who is chairman of the Budget Committee. He'll have a lot to do with whether you have more money in your pocket or not. Mr. and Mrs. America, Domenici is re-elected, holds on to a Republican Senate seat in New Mexico, beating three-term State Representative Judy Pratt. Moving on to Colorado, Senator William Bill Armstrong, a very strong supporter of President Reagan's program, beats Lieutenant Governor Nancy Dick. Nancy Dick, another of the women running for the Senate. There were 10 women running in Senate places. Nancy Dick never, frankly, was given much of a chance in this Senate race. She loses to Bill Armstrong. The Republicans hold on to the Senate seat in Colorado. In South Dakota, Senator Larry Pressler, the Republican incumbent, has beaten back the challenge of former George McGovern aide George Cunningham. Larry Pressler, the Republican, wins in South Dakota. In Louisiana, this Senator Bennett Johnston is re-elected to a third term. He actually was re-elected back on September 29th, in that he got more than 50% of the vote in the Louisiana primary. Now, Bob, we still don't see any signs of strong Reagan coattails in these Senate races as yet, given the fact that Lieutenant Governor John Kerry won in Massachusetts, held on to the seat from the retiring Paul Tsongas. The Democrats have a net gain of 1 in the Senate thus far.
That's right. So far in the Senate, Dan, it has been a night for the incumbents. Now, we have those very close races that you've talked about in North Carolina and so on. But so far, not an incumbent has been defeated. We might talk a little bit about that race down in Tennessee. Tennessee, where Albert Gore, the son of a senator, very popular congressman down there, beat his Republican opponent, Victor Ashe. This is one of those races where the man that the Republicans really wanted to run, the very popular governor, Lamar Alexander, chose not to run. From that moment on, Gore was the favorite in Tennessee. We might also talk a little bit about Massachusetts. Massachusetts, where John Kerry, the lieutenant governor, picked up the open seat, the seat that was left open by the retiring Democrat Paul Tsongas, beating Ray Shammy. Mr. Shammy managed to get himself in trouble on a couple of different issues. One of them involved the Liberty Lobby. There was a charge that the Liberty Lobby, which some people call an anti-Semitic group, had distributed literature in his plant. we see in our exit poll that was certainly a factor for Kerry. He got 73% of the Jewish vote in Massachusetts. That was much more than Ronald Reagan got.
And Ronald Reagan campaigned for Ray Shammy, the opponent for the winner, John Kerry, but it wasn't enough. His coattails weren't enough. His campaign in Massachusetts wasn't enough. We don't know the outcome of the presidential race in Massachusetts as yet. I'm just told that in the state of Michigan, the Wolverine state, which has gone to President Reagan earlier in the presidential campaign, in a Senate race there that got a lot of attention, the Democrats have held on to their Senate seat in Michigan. Our CBS News reports that Senator Carl Levin has been reelected. He's the former Detroit City Council member who was opposed. The Republican nominee was the former Space Shuttle astronaut and Skylab astronaut, Jack Lousma. Bob, Lousma was well-financed, but didn't run a strong campaign, at least not in the early going.
He also made a classic gaffe. At one point in the campaign, Levin revealed that Lousma had been in Japan addressing a Toyota convention and revealed that he was a Toyota owner. He later took that back and said that no, in fact, he wasn't a Toyota owner, that the car belonged to his son, and that his son had called from Texas to say how distraught he was and upset about hearing this come to light. Well, there'd also been a charge up there that Lousma was a carpetbagger who had really lived for the last 20 years in Texas. So it was that kind of a campaign. Levin was thought to be ahead, but the Democrats knew this was a tight one.
Well, because of the size of the Reagan win, apparently the Lousma gave a scare today into the Levin campaign, but the important thing for the moment is the Democrats hold on to their Senate seat in Michigan. Thus far, the Democrats have a net gain of 1 in the United States Senate, Gore winning that race in Tennessee. Still a lot of Senate races to be determined. And speaking of races to be determined, WCBS TV here in New York, our CBS owned and operated station and newsroom, is reporting that polls in New York, because of long lines of waiting voters, may be kept open beyond the scheduled closing hour of 9 o'clock. Now, it's past 9 o'clock in New York, but we mention this because if you hear reports that they're still voting in New York, it's because that so many people were in line at poll closing time that there had been some discussion of keeping the polls open past that 9 p.m. deadline. As we mentioned earlier in our interview with Jim Baker, the president's aide in California, religion played a very important role in this campaign, and Diane Sawyer has been looking at how it has played out in tonight's results. Diane?
That's right, Dan. A preacher from the religious right put it this way. He said that the mission in this campaign was to get people out of the pews and into the polls. And the religious right did register, and they did vote, and indeed they voted for Ronald Reagan as before, but this time in overwhelming numbers. On another religious note, Ronald Reagan is also carrying Catholics tonight by almost as big a margin as he's carrying the nation as a whole. But a footnote to that, as you know, Ronald Reagan sided with Catholic bishops on the question of abortion. But according to our poll, only 1 in 10 Catholic voters thinks that abortion is a key issue this time around in this campaign. All in all, it has been a campaign year in which religion played a very big and very vocal role, with Ronald Reagan making a direct pitch both to the religious right and to the Catholics, and Walter Mondale trying to fight back.
I have a deep religious faith. Our family does. It is fundamental. It's probably the reason that I'm in politics.
Religion and politics are necessarily related. We need religion as a guide.
The president walks around calling himself a good Christian. I don't for 1 minute believe it, because the policies are so terribly unfair.
It is a great honor to ask our Lord's blessing upon a man that many of us believe indeed to be our greatest president since Lincoln. Let us pray.
And that, of course, was the Reverend Jerry Falwell during the Republican convention this summer. And now the Reverend Jerry Falwell, founder of the Moral Majority, joins us from his headquarters in Lynchburg, Virginia. And good evening to you, sir.
Hello, Diane.
You called for a day of fasting for a spiritual awakening in this election. What do you think of the estimates so far tonight?
Well, obviously, we're very pleased. It's beyond our expectations. I have expected a 50-state win, but we were fearful of losing control of the Senate. It now seems that that's impossible to happen. With Jesse Helms some 10 points ahead in North Carolina, that was a major concern to us, and other areas. Our major thing has been registering voters, and conservative religious Americans traditionally have been outside the process. Well, we've been able to register millions of them, and
And thank God they went to the polls.
Do you take credit for tonight?
Pardon?
Are you taking credit for tonight?
Well, oh no. I think anyone who looks at the what's happening on the boards there will tell you that this is a massive grassroots victory. What's happened is that political conservatives and religious conservatives, for the first time, we did a little of it in 1980, but for the first time have gotten massively together, formed a massive majority, and while we both give and take a little in order to work together, we've learned how to do that. And, you know, we've been able to out-register Jesse Jackson 2-1. And obviously, millions of those people voted for the first time today.
Well, let's take a look at that alliance, because one of your conservative cohorts has said that you're fooling yourselves if you think at a second time around Ronald Reagan is going to give any more emphasis to the social issues than he gave you the first time around. And we heard James Baker say here earlier tonight that Jerry Falwell is not going to dictate policy to this president. Are you going to try to influence policy, and what is at the top of your agenda the second time around?
We've never tried to dictate policy.
What about influence?
And you know, the president was elected because a lot of people believe in him. I'm one of them. The platform of the Republican Party, which says that judicial appointments will be for persons in the federal judiciary at all levels who are committed to the sanctity of human life, born and unborn. That's Ronald Reagan's platform. That's what he believes. He has a book out on the subject.
But he appointed Sandra O'Connor.
Well, Sandra O'Connor is a very strong, wonderful addition to the court. And I believe looking at her, I think you get an idea of what he'll be doing. And contrary to what Mr. Mondale said, I'll not be appointing the justices. Mr. Reagan will. And I don't plan to have any input. And Mr. Baker knows me quite well. I've never called him and asked for a favor in 4 years. And he won't be hearing from me the next 4 years. I happen to believe in Ronald Reagan, and I think a great majority of the Americans here do.
You're confident that he will push to get you an amendment to ban abortion the next time around?
Well, not to get me one. I think that's what he believes in. He is for volunteer prayer in public schools. He's for strong national defense. He's against abortion. He is as strong on the abortion issue as I am. And so Jerry Falwell is not getting his agenda, nor is Archbishop O'Connor or Archbishop Law. Ronald Reagan is Ronald Reagan, and I think the last 4 years he's performed masterfully, and that's why he found the conservative religious public massively behind him this time.
The Reverend Jerry Falwell, thanks for your joining us tonight, and I guess it is a big night for you. Thank you very much.
We praise the Lord and thank the Lord for it.
Thank you. Back to you, Dan.
Thank you very much, Diane Sawyer. And this is the way things stand at this moment, just past 9:15 Eastern Time, with the polls open still in a lot of places in the country. And we're urging everybody who's still eligible to vote, where the polls are open, to please go out and vote. The national vote thus far, these are ballots in and counted, 15% of the precincts reporting nationwide. Ronald Reagan leads Walter Mondale 61% to 39%. Now, in the way that translates into the electoral vote, 270 electoral votes needed to win. Our CBS News estimate is that Ronald Reagan already has 349 electoral votes. Walter Mondale thus far has only 3. He's carried just the District of Columbia, and the question continues to be, can Ronald Reagan get a 50-state sweep? What will his final electoral vote total be? Richard Nixon got 520 electoral votes in winning the 1972 election. FDR got 523 electoral votes. Those are the two benchmarks for this half century. Look at this map, and you can see what a chance that Ronald Reagan has for an historic victory. The Reagan states in red. Walter Mondale, with only the District of Columbia, has 3 electoral votes. Ronald Reagan has 349. All those states in gray or white are undecided. Those are places where the decision is not yet in. The western states become increasingly important. That little flash in the right-hand side of your screen is the District of Columbia. It's so small, we have to bring the map up so you can see it. Mondale with the 3 electoral votes from the flashing District of Columbia. The rest of the map, red, going red for Ronald Reagan. These states in the western portion of the country now become increasingly important in determining. If someone says to you, well, no reason to go to the polls because it doesn't matter, it matters a lot if you're out in this section of the country where the polls are still open, because it matters. Does Ronald Reagan get that 50-vote sweep? What size mandate margin does he have? Does he get a working majority in the House? For those of you where the polls are still open, that decision is yours. You can be decisive with that. Our CBS News coverage of whether Ronald Reagan gets a 50-state sweep or not continues after these messages. Some bonfire hot Senate races are still burning in a number of sections of the country where the presidential race has already been decided. In Kentucky, where the Republicans have a chance for a pickup, no decision as yet. North Carolina, the most publicized Senate race, no decision yet. Illinois, West Virginia, those Senate races still to be decided. But as an example of the size of Ronald Reagan's winning margin, we don't know the dimensions of his coattails, but the size of his own personal winning margin, to get some idea of the dimensions, let's look at the results in some traditionally Democratic states. Illinois, 24 electoral votes in Illinois, with 5% of the precincts reporting. Reagan is carrying Illinois 53 to 47% over Walter Mondale. These are with votes in and counted. North Carolina, Reagan's margin with 12% of the precincts reporting is 63-37 over Walter Mondale. In Ohio, another state that Ronald Reagan has carried, with 15% of the vote now in and tabulated, Reagan's margin in Ohio, 61%. And in Michigan, a state with high unemployment, strong union state with 4% of the vote in and counted, Ronald Reagan is leading Walter Mondale by a whopping 66 to 34%. Bruce Morton, let's pull back and try to see what it is we know or what it is we think we know at this hour. What does this tell us when in these traditionally strong Democratic states, Ronald Reagan not only wins, but wins apparently by whopping margins?
Well, Dan, it tells you that the old New Deal coalition doesn't exist anymore. It tells you, too, I think, excuse me, that this is not just a one-time thing. That's the third presidential election in a row in which Michigan has gone Republican, and yet it used to be a Democratic state. I don't think we know enough to say realignment, but I think we know enough to say maybe de-alignment. We don't know what the issues will be next time. We don't know where these states will go next time. But the days when they used to go fairly automatically to Democrats, those days are over.
So the New Deal has been shattered, but what's going to be in its place, if anything, over the next 4 years, we don't yet know. The national vote at the moment, this is with the votes actually in and counted. The national vote story looks like this: 16% of the precincts reporting nationally. Reagan leads Mondale on the order of 60% to 70%. In the vote, in the struggle for the Electoral College, 270 electoral votes needed to win. Ronald Reagan already over the top and crashing through the ceiling with 349 electoral votes. Walter Mondale has carried only the District of Columbia and has 3 electoral votes in the District of Columbia. So the story at this hour, and we're about to go off here for a bit, but the story remains a strong one and a very interesting one. What is going to be the size of the Reagan tidal wave, and what does it carry in with it? Dan Rather at CBS News Election Headquarters in New York.
CBS News coverage of Campaign 84 Election Night continues. From CBS News Election Headquarters in New York, here again is Dan Rather.
And good evening again. If today were a fish, Walter Mondale would throw it back in, because the polls have closed in 41 states total. And in all 32 of them decided by this hour, all have gone to Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan, red on the map, Walter Mondale in blue. 352 electoral votes Ronald Reagan has, at least at this hour. CBS News estimates Ronald Reagan has 352. Walter Mondale has picked up only the District of Columbia. You see it blinking there at one point up in the right-hand part of your screen. Reagan 352, Mondale 3, with 270 electoral votes needed to win. Now, the questions, however, the questions that may very well be decided by the votes out here in the western portion of the country, in states, the Dakotas, Idaho, Utah, California, Hawaii, Alaska, Washington, Oregon. What may be decided out there is how big a mandate Ronald Reagan gets, and whether indeed he gets a 50-state sweep. 26 votes in the House of Representatives, that's the magic number. Ronald Reagan would love to change the makeup of the House by 26 more Republican members or not. If he gets that, he figures he'd have a working majority in the House. That may be decided by the votes that are still out in the western states. Very important votes. Every vote out there counts and matters a lot in the presidential race, in addition to all the others, because it may very well decide what kind of mandate and the size of the mandate that Ronald Reagan gets. Now, 3 more states have just dropped in to the Reagan column. Let's look them over. In Vermont, the Green Mountain State, which traditionally goes Republican, it has gone Republican. Ronald Reagan wins Vermont. Wisconsin, the Badger State, with 11 electoral votes and some of the best dairy cattle anywhere on the planet. Ronald Reagan wins it. None of the dairy cattle voted for him, but apparently a lot of other people did. A Reagan sweep in Wisconsin. And in New York, read it and weep if you're a Democrat, 36 electoral votes, a state where Governor Mario Cuomo was trying to do it for Walter Mondale. Mayor Ed Koch in New York was trying to do it for him. Geraldine Ferraro, Congresswoman from New York, was put on the ticket with hopes of holding New York for the Democrats. Ronald Reagan blows it all apart and carries the state of New York. Now, this is the way the national vote looks at this hour. A number of the votes are in and tabulated. The thousands are beginning to mount up now. 19% of the precincts reporting nationwide. Ronald Reagan leads Walter Mondale in these actually counted ballots, 60% to 40%. Reagan with just over 10.5 million votes among those counted thus far. Mondale with just over 7 million votes. Now, what we may be seeing here, and let's put the context to this, is Ronald Reagan becoming a kind of Babe Ruth of politics. The old Democratic coalition is gone, out of here. Ronald Reagan carries through the Solid South, through the Midwest, the old Rust Belt where the unions used to be strong. Ronald Reagan carrying state after state in there. Now, we may be seeing an avalanche of historic proportions. The question, can Ronald Reagan carry 50 states, still very much up for grabs. So far, Ronald Reagan has only carried the District of Columbia. Ronald Reagan started the night with a Republican majority of 55 to 45 in the House of, in the Senate. The Democrats have picked up 1 in Tennessee, Albert Gore. And now the question becomes, does the Senate stay Republican? Looks like it probably will. And does Ronald Reagan get a working majority in the House? And just in from North Carolina, in the Tar Heel State, in the most expensive, the roughest, meanest, most publicized Senate race in anybody's memory, Senator Jesse Helms, the 2-term incumbent and champion of the new national right, on the basis of our CBS News estimates, that's interviews with the voters who left the polls and returns from sample precincts, Jesse Helms has beaten Jim Hunt, the Democratic governor, served 2 terms as governor, and this was a race which everybody said pitted much more than just stakes in North Carolina, because the effort was on. This Senate race, mind you, cost in excess of $21 million. Senator Helms, with a lot of money from out of state, and Jim Hunt, the Democratic challenger, with a lot of money from out of state, both spent tremendously in North Carolina. Helms wins it in North Carolina, and the Reagan coattails unquestionably helped Senator Helms win re-election in North Carolina. Now, standing by to talk about all of this with us is Paul Laxalt, who was not up for re-election this time. Senator Laxalt, the senator from Nevada, who was President Reagan's longtime confidant, is campaign manager. Senator Laxalt, congratulations to you. A tremendous win of possibly historic proportions. But my question is, what is this going to mean to me and every other American in terms of our pocketbook?
Well, I hope that it means that your pocketbook condition, Dan, as long as with millions of other Americans, going to continue to improve. I talked to the president shortly after I left the plane on Sunday and asked him where we're going the next 4 years. I had a suspicion where we're going. He's going to continue to launch a huge assault on our economic policy and hope that the lot of all Americans will continue to approve.
Senator Laxalt, earlier Jim Baker talked about some kind of tax simplification. Now, is that a euphemism for tax increase?
No, as far as the president is concerned, he indicated no uncertain terms on the campaign trail these last several days, which is a reaffirmation of what he's been saying all along, no tax increases.
Well, does that mean then he's going to reduce the proportion of defense spending? Because surely with the national deficit being what it is, you can't have increasing defense spending and additional tax cuts.
Oh, well, you can, because the president's policy has been that we can grow out of this deficit situation and that we simply provide the people with more finances and resources that they can do the job. I think that's going to be what we're going to see here, because this president feels strongly that the policies he's pursued has worked, and I don't think anyone can seriously question that.
How about the social agenda, Senator Laxalt? The prayer in schools, a constitutional amendment for prayers in school, an amendment banning abortions. Is the president determined to push that social agenda in his second term?
I think he's going to continue to be determined to push that social agenda and attempt this time to be more successful than he was in the first 4 years to get it through the Congress.
Have you talked to him about that? Will he interpret this as a mandate to push for that agenda?
I think so. When you consider the various states that felt strongly about the social agenda, and they are principally in the South, of course, I just think it's a clear message to Ronald Reagan and the people of the country that the social agenda is important, extremely important to millions of Americans.
Senator Laxalt, we've been saying all evening that the president needs to get a net change of at least 26 additional Republican seats in the House of Representatives to get a working majority there. Would you agree with that assessment?
Well, I think 26 would certainly help because that recaptures the loss that we had last time out. A lot will depend, Dan, on the nature of the Democrats who are elected. And we have a number of Democrats, principally in the South, with conservative leanings. And if we elect more of those in the South, it would require less. But 26 would help us greatly, no doubt.
And from what you have seen, is there any chance at all that the Democrats could seize control of the Senate? They have a net pickup of 1 thus far, Gore in Tennessee.
No, there's no likelihood that I can see at all. Apparently, the Republican incumbents are holding, with the exception of the Baker seat that you mentioned in Tennessee. As a matter of fact, there's a chance of a pickup of 1 or 2, so I think the Republican situation in the Senate seems secure.
Thank you very much, Senator Paul Laxalt of Nevada, where Senator Laxalt is talking about the possibility of a Republican Senate pickup. Nebraska would be one of the places that he would be talking about. Our CBS News coverage of the campaign 1984 election results continues after this. If you care anything at all about American politics, certainly if you love it, you had to love the Senate race in North Carolina. Republican incumbent Jesse Helms against two-term Governor Jim Hunt. Helms wins it. Bob Schieffer, Helms, who traveled around the state in a little minivan called Avocado One near the end. And I noticed that very near the end, he came up and introduced himself to someone and says, hello, I'm Jesse Helms, or at least I used to be. He apparently was very tired of the campaign, but he wins it.
Well, Dan, I have a communique from the front in this war down there in North Carolina, some very interesting exit poll information. Jesse Helms does win over Jim Hunt, a very formidable challenger, a Democrat. Listen to this. Jesse Helms got 13% of the black vote. Now, I happen to know from a source in that campaign that they thought they were going to get so few black votes that they didn't even poll in the black community. He got only 5% of the black vote down there in 1978. This time he gets 13% of the black vote. 29% of the Democrats told us that they voted for Helms. 35% of the whites told us that they voted for Hunt. So again, in a southern state, we see a Democrat unable to carry the white vote.
I would think the Helms people and Senator Helms himself be watching the race in Illinois between Charles Chuck Percy, the Republican incumbent, and Paul Simon, the Democratic congressman, trying to unseat him because Percy's chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee,
and they will be pulling for the Democrat up there. In fact, most of the right wing of the Republican Party will be pulling for the Democrat because they sometimes, or many of them, see Percy as too liberal.
And Helms is next in line.
Helms is next in line on Senate Foreign Relations to become chairman of the committee. He promised during the heat of this campaign that he would stay on agriculture, where he's chairman also, because the people in North Carolina consider that very important for their state, being a big tobacco state. But now he'll be faced with a choice, if Percy is defeated, and we don't know yet, that race is still too close to call, whether he keeps that campaign promise. A lot of people in the right wing of the Republican Party will urge him to change his mind, I think.
Mixed signals in the Senate races thus far about whether President Reagan's coattails are carrying very much. The hour coming up soon, over, let's say, the next 45 minutes to an hour, the big story is going to be whether the Republicans pick up 26 or more seats in the House of Representatives. While we do some checking on that, let's note that every election writes its own scenario in a way, and this one sounds familiar, but Charles Kuralt offers a different view. Charles?
Dan, I guess we could summarize the election this way. A very popular president was running for his second term. His Opponents were truly alarmed by him, but they couldn't find anything to say about him that was bad enough to stick. The people just liked him, that's all. I'm not talking about President Reagan. I'm talking about President Jefferson.
It is 1804. Thomas Jefferson is standing for re-election. Since he took office in 1800, fortune has favored the United States with practically its first peace as a nation and practically its first prosperity. Thanks to an accident of history and then to Jefferson's swift action, the stupendous Louisiana Territory is now ours to explore. Who knows what wild wonders may now belong to us. Furthermore, the opposition Federalists have fielded a weak candidate, and when they say Jefferson is a radical, a fanatic, a friend of French Revolutionary terror, the voters shrug. A Federalist minister prays for the deist president, that the Lord bestow upon him a double portion of thy grace, for thou knowest he needs it. But the nation's flock is not frightened by this president. People like him. And in the end, the vote is a wipeout for the Federalist candidate, Charles C. Pinckney, 14 electoral votes. For Thomas Jefferson, Democratic Republican, 162.
It's probably a good idea to keep things in historical perspective, Dan. Nobody in 1984 thinks the Democrats are dead, that they're just going to roll over and die and never be heard from again. But back there in 1804, it really did look as if the Federalists had had it. And the idea pleased Jefferson, of course. He never liked the idea of parties in the first place, hated the squabbling and the struggle for power. So he was delighted by his landslide. He thought it was a sign of national unity.
Well, while he was fond of the First Amendment, Charles, he wasn't all that fond of reporters. You may recall that he said, and this is a direct quote, "I don't take a single newspaper, nor do I read one for a month, and I feel myself infinitely happier for it." West Virginia Senate race. Governor J. Rockefeller, John D. Rockefeller IV, second-term governor, trying to move up to the Senate, wins it over John Racy. Rockefeller beats Racy in the West Virginia Senate race. So while President Ronald Reagan carried West Virginia tonight, J. Rockefeller got a scare because President Reagan came in and campaigned for John Racy, and some thought that maybe Racy could pull it off, but Rockefeller wins. Now that's a hold on for the Democrats in West Virginia. Jennings Randolph retiring in that state. J. Rockefeller, and there's a man who'd like to think that one day he could be a presidential or at least a vice presidential nominee. Rockefeller wins in West Virginia. Now, let's take a look at the tabulated votes in two big states. In Pennsylvania, the Keystone State, 25 electoral votes in Pennsylvania. Ronald Reagan's carried the state with 41% of the precincts in and reported. The actual vote count shows Reagan carrying Pennsylvania about 53 to 47%. In Florida, the Sunshine State, 21 big electoral votes down there. It went early for Reagan, 35% of the precincts in and reporting now, and in actual votes tabulated, Reagan leads Mondale 65 to 35% in Florida. In Texas, the Lone Star State, Ronald Reagan gets those 29 electoral votes. In the vote actually tabulated, 22% of the precincts in. Those are the totals. Reagan running about 65% in Texas. Our CBS News coverage of Ronald Reagan's bid to become a historic president and carrying all 50 states continues after these messages. And good evening again. A possible historic presidential election evening in the making. The story still Ronald Reagan all over the map in the states so far decided, as decision hour moves westward now into some traditional Republican territory of the Rocky Mountain West. The story told so far is of a smashed Democratic New Deal coalition in the East and in the South, for that matter, that kept the Democrats going strong for half a century. The still untold story of the night, with Walter Mondale so far carrying only the District of Columbia. The untold story of the night, do Ronald Reagan's coattails recut the cloth of Congress and give him effective majority control in the House of Representatives to get his policies and progress onto the law books? It's 10 p.m. in the East. Now, at the electoral vote at the last count was 416 for Reagan, 3 for Walter Mondale. But however, as the polls have just closed in a majority of the places in 5 states worth 25 electoral votes, so the electoral total is growing. Of the 20 of the 5 western states, 4 have gone to Ronald Reagan. Mondale has picked up none of the states decided this hour. I want to repeat to you, 5 western states are now reporting, 25 electoral vote total. Ronald Reagan has cleared 4 of them, and his electoral vote total stands at 416, counting these 4 new states. Walter Mondale has picked up nothing new, has only the District of Columbia so far. However, Iowa remains in the undecided category. There is a chance where what amounts to Walter Mondale's prevent defense to prevent Ronald Reagan from getting a 50-state sweep might come into play. Iowa, undecided. Now, let's look where the places where Ronald Reagan's electoral vote total has grown just in the last few moments. In Utah, probably the most Republican state in the Union, 5 electoral votes, Ronald Reagan wins them. This state gave Reagan his biggest majority the last time out. The Beehive state, Utah, goes for Ronald Reagan. In Idaho, the gem state with 4 electoral votes, Ronald Reagan sweeps away Walter Mondale's chances there, which Mondale's chances were never considered very good in Idaho, another very Republican state. In Montana, the Treasure State with 4 electoral votes, Ronald Reagan beats Walter Mondale in Montana. The Reagan wagon train continues to roll right on through the Silver State, Nevada. 4 electoral votes. Ronald Reagan, as was expected, wins it. Now, look, however, remember that Iowa remains undecided. Here are 2 states that Walter Mondale could still carry. Massachusetts has not yet fallen into anyone's column. With 29% of the vote actually in and tabulated in the battle for Massachusetts' 13 electoral votes, Walter Mondale is leading in Massachusetts 52 to 48%. I caution this is with only 29% of the vote actually in and tabulated. The Democrats have already held on to the Senate seat with the election of Lieutenant Governor John Kerry in Massachusetts. And in Minnesota, Walter Mondale's home state, the North Star states, 10 electoral votes still very much up for grabs. With 2% of the vote in and tabulated in Minnesota, Mondale is leading Reagan 57 to 43%. Again, a little yellow flag caution. That's with only 2% of the precincts actually in and reporting. Now, in the Iowa Senate race, one of the more watched Senate races anywhere in the country, Senator Roger Jepsen, a Republican, on the basis of our CBS News interviews with voters as they left the polls today, Jepsen has lost in Iowa. Tom Harkin, 5-term U.S. Congressman, a Democrat, has beaten Senator Roger Jepsen in Iowa. We want to be talking about this because Harkin's campaign was based on casting Jepsen, the Republican, as a big spender, called him Red Ink Roger Jepsen, and Tom Harkin picks up a Senate seat for the Democrats in Iowa. In Idaho, the Senate seat there held by Republican Jim McClure, a 2-term incumbent and a former congressman. The Republicans hold on to that one as McClure beats Bush in Idaho. In Rhode Island, Senator Claiborne Pell, 4-term incumbent and the ranking Democrat on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, has beaten back the challenge of Barbara Leonard, a businesswoman with no previous public office experience. Another of the 10 women who were trying for the Senate is beaten as Pell holds on to that seat for the Democrats in Rhode Island. Well, Bob Schieffer, in the midst of this enormous Reagan tide, this tidal wave, there is some good news for the Democrats in that they've picked up a net gain thus far of 2 seats in the Senate.
Tennessee and Iowa. Roger Jepsen was thought to be the most vulnerable Republican senator running this year. You know, he had all kind of problems, Dan. He's the senator, you know, who joined the health spa out in Iowa. It later turned out that that place was closed down as a house of prostitution. It was just one thing or another. He got a lot of publicity when he tried to, or used his senatorial immunity to try to explain away a traffic ticket. He just didn't have a very good year. Harkin was thought to be a good candidate from the beginning, and as you said, this was always thought to be Walter Mondale's best chance next to Minnesota out in the Midwest. A little exit poll information here. It was the farm vote that went for Harkin, 53 to 46%. The farmers in Iowa have had a real tough time of it. They have not shared in the Reagan recovery. Women went for Harkin, college graduates for Harkin, and the main reason that voters cited was the economy. 31% of the people out there said the economy was the issue and voted for Harkin.
Well, Bob, we still continue to get mixed signals about what the public wants in terms of the Senate. The evening started with Ronald Reagan and the Republicans having a 55-45 bulge in the Senate. The Democrats now have a net gain pickup thus far of 2, Gore in Tennessee and Harkin in Iowa. However, in terms of the mandate, you still have to believe where it's going to be decided is in those House races, and whether Ronald Reagan can get 26 or more additional Republican seats in the House. Among the Senate races still outstanding, the Republicans still have a chance to pick up in Kentucky. Dee Huddleston, the Democratic incumbent in Kentucky,
is in a very close battle apparently down there. We still have not called that race. That was one that the Democrats were supposed to win. You know, I think one of the things we should talk about, Dan, is a lot of people wonder, well, why is it when you have a Reagan landslide like this one is, that it doesn't have an effect on these Senate races? One reason, I think, is that Senate races these days, because they get so much publicity, so much television, pretty much operate in their own orbit. Another reason I think we can point to tonight is that in many of these races, the Republicans' best candidates didn't run. Delaware, for example, Pete DuPont was the Republican thought to have the best chance to beat Joe Biden there. He did not run this year. Down in Tennessee, we talked a little earlier about Lamar Alexander, a very popular governor there, who chose not to run for the Senate. So in each of these cases, I think that individual things like that have had some impact, just as in Iowa tonight. I don't think you can draw any national conclusions from that race, simply because Jepsen just had such a controversial time of it when he was in the Senate.
Also, Iowa has a reputation for throwing out incumbent senators. They've done a lot of it in recent years.
They really have. They really have.
Leslie Stahl, we're seeing some Republican inroads in the House thus far, but not real deep cutting by the GOP, at least not yet.
Not yet, but we have 3 veteran Democratic incumbents who have been defeated by Republicans tonight. In at least 2 of these, Ronald Reagan went and campaigned in that district, and it's safe to say that he made a big difference. Let me tell you what they are. First, in Missouri, in the St. Louis suburbs, the Republican John Buechner has defeated Robert Young, who has been in the Congress for 4 terms. Ronald Reagan went there, as I said. Blue-collar votes apparently making the difference. Over in Connecticut, in Waterbury, Ronald Reagan had a huge rally in Waterbury, Connecticut. Bill Ratchford, the Democratic incumbent, has been defeated by 27-year-old John Rowland, who wrapped himself around Ronald Reagan in his campaign ads. In New Jersey, veteran Joseph Minish has been defeated by Dean Gallo, a state assemblyman. Here is another man who ran on Ronald Reagan's tax program, Dean Gallo, and attacked Minish for being too liberal. That district was redistricted, and it went against Minish, who has been in Congress for 11 terms. So there are 3 veteran Democratic incumbents who have been defeated. But then I have a case here in Delaware where an incumbent Democrat is held on from the class of 1982. Tom Carper has beaten Elise DuPont, the Republican, the wife of the governor there. We'll be talking about women as the night goes on. She was defeated. So we have sort of a mixed result. And it's a little too early to tell if Ronald Reagan is going to get that mandate, Dan. We don't know yet.
Well, in the House, Leslie, let's review that the Democrats came in tonight in the House of Representatives with an overwhelming majority, 267 to 166. We make that read, I think, on the graphic you've been showing us, maybe 268 to 167, because that's the way the House was before 2 members died. But nonetheless, the Democrats have an overwhelming majority in the House. What we're talking about is getting a working or ideological majority. The president, to get that, needs a pickup of 26, 27 at least Republican seats in the House. Now to the point. As of this hour, and what little we think we know right now, what are his chances of doing that?
It's hard to say. It looks as though he's heading toward a significant victory in the House. Significant would be 20 or above. It's probably not going to be 26, but it will be very close, and that will make a difference on a lot of key votes.
And maybe we just ought to say, when you say it probably won't be at this hour, we're guessing, because returns on these House races sometimes come in very slowly. Right now, what doesn't come in slowly, however, is the electoral vote count. But for the moment, let's take a look at the ballots in and tabulated, which does come in rather slowly on a nationwide basis, with 30% of the precincts in and reporting. Ronald Reagan has a 59 to 41% lead over Walter Mondale. Reagan with just over 16 million votes. Mondale, among the ballots counted, just over 11 million votes. However, on the map, you can see how the electoral vote goes. Reagan has 416 electoral votes, many of them coming from the South and the Northeast, but also sweeping right on through the Midwest, out on into the West. Ronald Reagan has carried every state thus far. Walter Mondale has carried only the District of Columbia with 3 electoral votes. We'll be back in a moment with more from our CBS News election headquarters. In Tennessee, Albert Gore gets that. Tom Harkin has beaten Roger Jepson, the incumbent Republican in Iowa, so the Democrats have picked up 2 seats in the Senate. The Republicans still retaining control of the Senate, and they're expected to do that. The question still begs, is Ronald Reagan's coattail long enough, strong enough to pull in a working ideological majority in the House? The Democrats are assured of retaining actual control of the House, but if Ronald Reagan can pick up 26 or more Senate seats in the House of Representatives, there's reason to believe he'd have a working majority. Now, at our last look, the needle was sort of pointing in the direction of, well, maybe Ronald Reagan will not get enough House seats to give him a working majority in the House. We still don't know whether that will be the case or not. And if you want to watch and say to yourself, well, now, what's important from here on out in this election? Ronald Reagan is going to be our new president. No question is more important than that question of, does he get a working majority in the House of Representatives? Now, the polls remain open in a number of western states. Any place in the country where the polls are still open, if you're a registered voter, we urge you to go to the polls and vote. Your vote does matter. It matters in the presidential races. We've said before, it matters in this regard. President Reagan, his aides, the Democrats, the Senate and the House are all going to be looking at the size of the Reagan mandate. It does make a difference. If you believe Ronald Reagan, you want him to carry all 50 states and the polls are still open, you're registered to vote, go out and vote that way. If you don't want him to do that, if you want to get Democratic incumbents to retain their seats, then go out and vote that way. The point is, if you're eligible, the polls are still open in your area, vote. Then come back and watch our coverage. Dan Rather at CBS News election headquarters in New York.
CBS News coverage of Campaign 84 election night continues. From CBS News election headquarters in New York, here again is Dan Rather.
10:30 p.m. in the East, and this is the way the national map looks at 427 electoral votes for Ronald Reagan, Walter Mondale with 3, winning so far only the District of Columbia. Now, with the decisions in 2 more states, that is, when I say decisions, I don't mean the states reported this hour, but we at CBS News are now prepared to add 2 more states to the Ronald Reagan column. As his electoral margin grows, only the blinking District of Columbia up in the right-hand corner of your screen indicates Walter Mondale's only 3 electoral votes thus far. Ronald Reagan has 427 electoral votes. His hopes of a 50-state sweep, which no president has ever done, those hopes are still alive. He still has a chance to get more electoral votes than any president in history. Now, in the state of Iowa, our CBS News estimate is at this moment that President Reagan has carried the state of Iowa. And let me correct myself and say that this is on the basis of a CBS News exit poll, our interviews with actual voters as they came out of the polling places. CBS News puts the 8 electoral votes that Iowa has in the Ronald Reagan column. Now, this is a case of the president's coattails not extending to the Senate race because a Senate incumbent, Roger Jepson, has been beaten in Iowa by the Democratic challenger Tom Harkin, but Reagan keeps Iowa in the presidential election column for himself. And in Wyoming, 3 electoral votes, Ronald Reagan, as expected, beats Walter Mondale in Wyoming. Now, the big story that remains to be decided is, does Ronald Reagan's coattails extend enough to give him a working majority in the House? And Leslie Stahl, we're now beginning to see enough results to get the answer to that question, aren't we?
We are, Dan. CBS News is ready to estimate, on the basis of tabulated votes, that Republicans will pick up around 14 seats. That's a little less than we had thought when the night started, given the enormity of the landslide, particularly in electoral votes. 14 is less than I think even the Republicans had thought originally. They were talking about 20 seats. But let's look at what this means. The current House is made up of 168 Republicans, 267 Democrats. According to our CBS News estimate, when the night's over, the Republicans will have 182, the Democrats 253, for a net gain of about 14. As I said, that's a little surprising. We have some reason, an explanation for it. A lot of key demographic groups are splitting their ticket. The majority of Catholics voting for Reagan, turning around voting Democratic for Congress. Working women, 51% of working women voting for Ronald Reagan, turning around voting Democratic. We have young voters voting overwhelmingly 2-to-1 for Ronald Reagan, voting 49% for a Democrat, and the same in the South. In the South, Ronald Reagan is beating Mondale 60 to 36%, but they are splitting their vote when it comes to the Democrat. Let me give you two examples of incumbent Democrats who are expected to lose, both extremely vulnerable. They have held on tonight. First, in Ohio, in Toledo, a woman, the incumbent Marcy Kaptur, class of '82, has defeated Frank Venner, the Republican. Dan, he's a TV anchorman. He's the Dan Rather of Toledo, Ohio.
Now, who is this?
This is Frank Venner, has been defeated by Marcy Kaptur. He is the Dan Rather of Toledo, Ohio.
Well, I hope you've
He's been
gotten
defeated,
his approval. Been defeated. Well, I can relate to that. I'd like to say, Leslie, that he's the Dan Rather of where in Ohio.
Toledo, Ohio.
He may have been beaten, but not defeated.
I'll go with that. I endorse that. Can I tell you about another? Let's move quickly along. Please, let's move quickly along. In Indiana, in Muncie, the incumbent Phil Sharp has won re-election against a conservative Republican, Ken McKenzie, who latched on to Ronald Reagan's coattails and did not win. So, Dan, you see that the Democrats who ran ads urging voters who were going to vote for Ronald Reagan to vote for Democrats as an insurance policy against too much of a conservative tide in the Congress seem to have been successful with that approach. 14, as I say, is not that significant a victory.
Well, we need to say that this is our CBS News estimate. As we've tried to say many, many times before, that figuring out how the House is going to go is a very difficult and dangerous line of work. That's our estimate at the moment. Now, in fairness, President Reagan's people, the people who ran his campaign, the people who did his polling, had been saying for a long, long while that they thought they'd pick up somewhere between 12 and 16 or 17 seats. However, in the last week or 10 days, they began to say, well, we just think we might get 26 or 30, didn't they?
Well, a lot of the Republicans in Congress were saying 20. I always thought the White House was being a little conservative, so when we got to 20, we would say it was a major victory. I would say overall the Republicans thought they would do a little better because I think they did see the president's victory. But let me say something even about 14. The president had a lot of very close votes in the last Congress. MX missile, that only passed by one vote. 14 can make a big difference. School prayer, there was a vote on vocal school prayer, denying federal funds to districts that didn't allow vocal school prayer in the schools. That only lost by 21 votes. That's 11, just 11 more Republicans would have helped there.
No question, a pickup 14 would be helpful to the president, but it doesn't speak loudly to his mandate and a mandate for all of his policies. Correspondent Terry Drinkwater talked to Senator Gary Hart, who lost to Walter Mondale, of course, in the Democratic primaries, and Senator Hart told Drinkwater that this does not amount to a Reagan mandate.
Ronald Reagan, there was some discussion earlier this evening about a mandate. Ronald Reagan chose not to seek an issues mandate. He won a popularity contest. By being vague, by being general, he did not put forward an issues or vision for this country's future or issues platform. And so, at most, his victory is a triumph of personality and not of policy or program or direction.
You make it sound as if the Democratic Party were in pretty good health tonight. Now, really, what aren't there problems? I understand.
Sure. I think there are problems in our party. I think there are problems in the Republican Party. Everyone agrees that about 8 a.m. tomorrow morning, the Republican Party is going to fly in about 18 different directions as the struggle begins for leadership in 1988. As of 8 a.m. tomorrow morning, Ronald Reagan is, in effect, a lame duck leader of his party, and everyone agrees there's going to be a tremendous scramble, and a much, if I may say so, bitter scramble in the Republican Party for its future leadership than in the Democratic Party.
Our CBS News coverage of what Ronald Reagan's re-election will mean to you continues after these messages.
CBS News coverage of Campaign 84 Election Night continues. This portion is sponsored by General Motors. Extra time, extra effort, and attention to every detail. GM is committed to excellence. By Sun Company, where there's sun, there's energy. And by AT&T, we're reaching out in new directions. And now from CBS News election headquarters in New York, here again is Dan Rather.
Good evening again. Time and tide running wide for Ronald Reagan tonight, but not, apparently, at least not yet, running deep or deep enough in terms of washing away Democratic policy control of the House of Representatives. Still, a so far unbroken streak of popularity for President Reagan personally. It is 11 p.m. in the East now. Not a single state so far tonight in the Mondale column. He has only the District of Columbia. The polls just now closing in 4 states out west, including the single largest electoral vote block state of California, so the electoral vote total is growing. Ronald Reagan's own home state, California, where Walter Mondale put in a lot of time, money, and effort. Our CBS News exit polling indicates that Ronald Reagan has carried the state of California, which increases his electoral vote total to 474 electoral votes and leaves Walter Mondale still carrying thus far only the District of Columbia with 3 electoral votes. Of the 4 states where the polls have closed at this hour, 68 electoral votes in these states out west alone. 1 state has gone to Ronald Reagan, that's the state of California. The others remain undecided as of now. 3 states out there still undecided. Also undecided, 2 states where Walter Mondale has a chance to stop Ronald Reagan's effort for a 50-state sweep. So far, Mondale has blinking there, the District of Columbia up in the middle right-hand corner of your screen. But let's take a look at Massachusetts and Minnesota, 2 states that have not yet been colored on our map for Ronald Reagan. Here are the tabulated votes in those 2 states. Perhaps the last gasp chance Walter Mondale has of preventing a 50-state sweep. In Massachusetts, 13 electoral votes. This is the way the tabulated vote looks in Massachusetts at this moment. Well, apparently we can't get the tabulated vote up, but at our last report, Walter Mondale was leading in Massachusetts. Now, mark well, that's not to say that Mondale has carried Massachusetts, but at our last count, Walter Mondale was leading in Massachusetts, so he has a chance to carry the Bay State's 13 electoral votes. And in Minnesota, Walter Mondale's home state, with 12% of the precincts reporting, these are actual ballots in and counted, Walter Mondale is also leading in Minnesota. It's still very early out there. So, while Ronald Reagan has carried every state thus far that has been decided, it is not yet assured that Ronald Reagan will get an unprecedented 50-state sweep. Walter Mondale has a chance to carry Massachusetts. He has a chance to carry Minnesota, and he still has a chance. That's all the chance he has in the Midwestern and eastern part of the country. He still has a chance to carry Washington, Oregon, possibly Hawaii, not considered much of a chance to carry Alaska at all. In Oregon, while we don't have a final result in Oregon in terms of how it's going to go in the presidential election, 3-term incumbent Republican Senator Mark Hatfield, CBS News feels comfortable in saying that Hatfield has won the Senate race in Oregon. That's a hold on to a Senate seat for the Republicans. Hatfield beating Margie Hendrickson, the state senator in Oregon. Now, the picture at this hour, in terms of the presidential race, an absolute avalanche for Ronald Reagan, and the only question seems to be whether or not he's going to get a 50-state sweep. In the Senate, mixed signals, a pickup thus far of 2 Democratic seats, Gore in Tennessee, Harkin in Iowa, unseating a Republican incumbent senator out there, but the Republicans look to be retaining control of the Senate. In the House of Representatives, our latest CBS News estimate is that Ronald Reagan and the Republicans will pick up about 14 seats in the House. That would not, in most people's estimate, give the president a working majority in the House of Representatives. Now, in the state of Nebraska, a state that long ago was put in the Reagan column for the presidential vote, the Democrats hold on to a Senate seat in Nebraska on the basis of our CBS News exit polling, that is, interviewing people actually left the polling places. Senator James J.J. Exon, the former governor, holds on to a Democratic seat, beating back the challenge of Nancy Hoke, the University of Nebraska Board of Regents member. So the Democrats hold on to their Senate seat in Nebraska, another place where the president's coattails weren't long enough to bring in a Republican victory. In Wyoming, the incumbent Republican Senator Alan Simpson, as was expected, beats the Democratic challenger Victor Ryan, the chemistry professor from the University of Wyoming. So the Republicans hold on to their Senate seat in Wyoming. Bob Schieffer, how well is the president doing in the Senate races tonight? And double check me, so far we have a net gain of 2 for the Democrats.
I did a little arithmetic, Dan, and mind you, somebody said the reason people go into journalism is because they're not very good at arithmetic. In fact, I think you said that.
It's certainly true in my case.
But listen to this. If the Democrats lose Kentucky and they don't take Illinois, both of those races are still too close, the worst they can do is wind up with a net gain of 1 tonight, and you'd have a Senate that is 54 Republicans and 45 Democrats. If they win those seats, they would wind up with a 2-seat loss for the Republicans. The Republicans would wind up with 53 seats, the Democrats 47. A couple of other little things that come under the adding and subtracting category. As of now, Leslie was talking a while ago about the working majority that they were trying to get in the House. As of now, the Senate is going to be a little more liberal no matter what happens the rest of the night. We did some addition on some of the important issues. On MX, as of now, there are 2 fewer votes in the Senate for MX than there were at the start of the evening. Now, that's based on public positions that people who have been elected to the Senate tonight and people who are already in the Senate have taken. There are 2 less votes for MX there now. On the balanced budget amendment, that's one of Ronald Reagan's pet issues. You notice we middle-aged men have to hold these way out so we can see them. 2 fewer votes for the balanced budget amendment in the Senate now, and on school prayer, 2 fewer votes for that.
Well, the only thing about you're saying middle-aged men, I don't know very many people who are 100.